Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Aimimo design AD-8168. This watch is available from Certified Distributor Watch Store on AliExpress for €83. So firstly, let's look at the box that the watch comes in, and then I'll talk you through the other items one gets with the piece. So the watch comes in this black cardboard watch box. One removes the lid. There's a foam protective panel, and the watch sits on a piece of foam inside a foam cutout panel in the base, as one would expect. Although basic, it does suffice in protecting the watch in shipping from any damage, and I think it's perfectly acceptable to use a cardboard watch box, bearing in mind this is a low tier price point piece at only €83. This is the owner's instruction manual, clear concise diagrams. The instructions are in English, and it details the operation of the movement use, which is the Miyota caliber 8215 automatic. And lastly, one also gets this Aimimo design branded microfiber polishing cloth. I always think it's a nice touch to get a branded microfiber polishing cloth, irrespective of the price point of a piece. So, with regards to the specifications of the piece, this is the Aimimo design AD-8168. The watch is clearly an homage to the Patek Philippe Nautilus. We have a 41.5mm case diameter. We have a 46.3mm lug-to-lug measurement, a thickness of 10.9mm. The integrated lug width at the widest point is 24.4mm, and it tapers down from 24.4 down to 16.7 at the 2-button push hidden deployment. As a cost-cutting measure, the 2-button push deployment is unsigned and sterile. I would prefer to see a Aimimo design or a brand emblem engraved, but however, one has to expect some cost-cutting measures because this is only €83. On a positive note, the 2-button push triggers have a nice firm resistance, and both halves of the deployment open easily, as you can see, and they also snap shut with a nice positive click to both the left and the right hand portion, so it's a very well executed deployment. Mirror polished to the top side, underside and flanks, and also the triggers are mirror polished, and also the milled sections are brush satin finish, so it's actually finished to a good standard, bearing in mind the price point. No sharp edges, no burrs, and it works very well. With regards to the rest of the specification, we have a flat sapphire crystal. Now, the negative is there is no AR coating on the underside, and this piece would really benefit from anti-reflective coating because, as you can see, when I tilt the piece at an oblique angle, there is a lot of glare and highly reflective nature to the underside to the flat sapphire crystal. It's a very shiny and reflective piece, and therefore that reduces the legibility. It is very shiny and reflective and hard to read the time. Now, with regards to the handset and the indices, they've made an error with this. Yes, it does do a good job of being an homage to the Nautilus style with the horizontal stripes and also the applied indices and the baton hands. But however, the hands and the indices are different. The applied indices are silver mirror polished, but the handset are black. And it's a clash because we've got silver indices and a black handset. They should have made the applied indices black to match the black hands, or alternatively silver mirror polished the baton hands to match the applied indices, because there is a clash. Now, the problem with the lack of AR coating is the silver applied indices are very shiny and highly reflective, but on a positive note, the black hands do contrast very well with the Tiffany dial, and therefore the legibility of the hands is good, although the legibility of the silver applied indices would be better if it had AR coating. Now, with regards to the dial layout, I like the fact it's not over-branded with unnecessary text or specification. We don't have a water resistance rating at 6 o'clock, for example, because this is a daily wear piece and it's not a dive watch. But I think the dial would be better balanced if they'd moved automatic from underneath the Aimimo design at 12 and placed automatic across the dial at the 6 o'clock position. Because as it is, the 6 o'clock position of the dial looks very bare, and it really would look better if it had automatic printed. But however, this is subjective. Some collectors might like Aimimo design and automatic at 12. The dial layout does have good symmetry, and the date complication is well proportioned. We have a white date wheel with black Arabic numerals. So the finishing to the Tiffany dial is very good, and the textured finish to it with the horizontal stripes does add interest to it, so it does do a very good job of being an homage to the Nautilus dial. It's just a shame they didn't scale up the proportions of the handset, because if you look at the second hand, it's too short. It doesn't reach the minute ticks on the chapter ring. The minute hand doesn't extend to the chapter ring, and the hour hand doesn't extend to the applied indices, so they should have made the hands larger and longer, and that would have better matched the proportion of the indices on the dial. With regards to the finishing to the bezel, it's actually finished to a very high standard. Brush satin finishing is very good. The mirror polishing to the edge of the bezel is also flawless. And the finishing to the head of the piece is very impressive, bearing in mind this is €83. It's a low tier price point piece. Brushed satin finishing is good. And because we've got integrated lugs, we don't have spring bars. So as you can see, they've drilled holes in the lugs, and that means one can depress the spring bar inside the integrated lugs and remove the integrated bracelet. So it's actually very well executed. I'm very impressed with the quality of the brushed satin finishing to the flanks, and also the mirror polishing is done to a high standard. Right, so I'll show you the case back. Screw down exhibition case back, glazed with mineral crystal. The milled slots are very well executed, no sharp edges, no burrs. Concentric CNC lathe tool machining is done to a good standard, and is also engraved with the reference number and specification of the piece around the circumference to a good standard. It does a good job of displaying the movement used, which is the Miyota caliber 8215. Now, it's an undecorated basic movement, but however it is nice to be able to see it through the exhibition case back. The underside to the head of the piece is finished very well in a brushed satin finish, no sharp edges to the underside to the flanks. So the exhibition case back is very good, and it's relatively low profile, bearing in mind it is 100 metres, not 50 metres water resistance, so they've done a good job of the exhibition case back. With regards to the crown, it's coin edge finished, solid 316L grade stainless steel, and as you can see, matte bead blasted effect to the background, and we have a mirror polished Aimimo design emblem finished to a good standard. So let's test the screw down crown execution. Now, it does feel stiff, it's not smooth, and there is a lot of friction, so there is room for improvement with regards to the machining of the internal thread of the stainless steel crown and the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. But on a positive note, it is a screw down crown, and it provides an effective hermetic seal to 100 metres. They could have used the cost cutting measure of a push pull crown and 50 metres of water resistance, so they deserve credit for using a screw down crown and keeping the specification to 100 metres. I think it's very good, bearing in mind this is a daily wear piece. So in the first position is the manual wind position, and one can manually wind the Miyota caliber 8215 to top it up to its maximum 40-hour power reserve. It does feel nice and smooth to manually wind, very similar to a Seiko NH35A, and it feels smooth. I like it, so I think it's a pleasure to manually wind. Putting it out to the first click position is the quick set date complication. So rotating the crown anti-clockwise advances the quick set. Nice positive click to the quick set complication. Good indexing to every day of the month. It does feel lighter than an NH35A or an NH38, which you may be familiar with. I actually prefer the more positive, heavier clicks of the quick set complication on a 35A and a 38. The 8215 feels lighter, although it does work very well. Now, pulling it out to the final click position is the time setting position. Early versions of the Miyota 8215 did not have hacking, which was a main negative, but as you can see, I'm pleased to report Aimimo Design are using the latest version of the 8215, and that does have hacking. If you look at the second hand, you can see I have now stopped it. I've hacked the movement. So it's possible to set the time precisely to the second, and I'm pleased that they are not using early versions of the 8215 without hacking. Now, in terms of time setting resistance, it doesn't feel as good as a NH35A or the NH38. It's a characteristic of the 8215. There is some back play, both clockwise and anti-clockwise. For example, if you look at the crown now, I'm rotating the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise, but the minute hand isn't moving immediately. You see there's some back play clockwise and anti-clockwise. One doesn't get that with a 35A or a 38. There's an immediate pickup. When one rotates the crown clockwise or anti-clockwise, the minute hand immediately moves. There's no back play with the 35A. But with the 8215, it does have clockwise and anti-clockwise back play, as you can see. So there is some back play in the gearing, and that does take some getting used to. And the resistance does feel firmer on the 8215. It feels lighter on the 35A. So I prefer the time setting on the 35A and the 38. The movement feels more solid. We don't have the back play, and also like the lighter resistance in the gearing. But having said that, it does work very well. Pushing it back in, it's got a nice positive click, and that restarts the movement. So let's test screwing the crown back down. Now, we don't have immediate thread pickup. One has to rotate the crown backwards and then clockwise again in order to get the threads to interface. And again, there is some friction. One can feel the friction of the internal thread of the stainless steel crown binding against the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. So there is room for improvements on the machining of the threads. It does screw down okay, but it just has a lot of friction. It's not as smooth as on a Pagani design screw down crown, for example, or a steel dive SD 1953, 1953, which you might be familiar with. So it's just a rough crown, and it does work, but I think that they really need to improve upon the quality control, build quality and finishing of the machining to the threads. Right, so I'll give you a wrist shot and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. Now, I haven't sized the bracelet. I've simply taken the watch out of the watch box, and I'm pleased to report it fits my 8-inch wrist perfectly without any sizing. So this will fit up to an 8-inch wrist, and I can just fit my index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp. So it's good that they've included enough links for a larger wrist. Now, in terms of wrist presence, it is very satisfying if you have a larger wrist, because it's 41.5mm head of the piece. So it's a large piece and it does wear with wrist presence. It also has quite reasonable heft. It's 147 grams, which is what one would expect with a circa 40 or 41mm head of the piece. So the integrated bracelet does add some heft to it. Now, the negative of the integrated bracelet is it does limit one's options for straps. One cannot fit conventional 20 or 22mm NATO rubber or leather straps to this. One has to use the integrated bracelet. So that's something you might dislike, not being able to use regular straps that are 20mm. But having said that, the Nautilus style bracelet is finished to a good standard. Good mirror polishing to the centre links, and that contrasts very well with the brushed satin finish H links in the bracelet. Nice taper from 24.4 down to 16.7 at the hidden 2-button push deploy. So very comfortable piece to wear despite the heft, 147 grams. The thing I most like about it is its very low profile for an automatic. It's only 10.7mm thick. Now, usually with an automatic, one would expect it to be circa 12mm because it has a rotor on the underside of the movement. And this has an exhibition case back which has 100 meters. And normally 100 meters means it needs to be thicker than 50 meters. But it's still only 10.7mm thick, so it's a very low profile piece. And although it does have wrist presence, it will easily slip underneath a shirt cuff if you wear business shirts, so an ideal daily wear piece. It's a good homage to the Nautilus. It does have a very similar Gerald Genter design case shape, and the bezel is very nicely finished. As you can see, I like the brushed satin finishing on the top, which contrasts with the mirror polishing to the edges of the bezel. So it's a well-finished case, well-finished bracelet. It does feel very comfortable to wear for long periods of time, such as 8 to 12 hours per day. But the main negative is the lack of AR coating, as you can see, because it's very shiny, very glossy. The sapphire crystal has a lot of glare to it. And they've compounded this by using silver mirror polished indices rather than black to match the black baton hands. So the legibility is poor despite the good symmetry to the dial, but however the Tiffany dial is a very aesthetically pleasing colour. So good wrist presence, comfort's good, does feel balanced. The integrated bracelet does balance the head of the piece very well, but I would say this is best suited to collectors with a larger wrist of 7 to 8 inches because 41.5 is large. Has a relatively short lug-to-lug measurement of only 46.3. They could have lengthened it slightly. 48mm is the sweet spot. The only thing to note is with the integrated bracelet, it does have an abhorrent gap underneath the case. They should have made the case more curved. It's got a very straight and flat profile to the underside to the case, and one gets a gap at either end of the lugs. So they could have improved upon this, because usually with integrated links, the ends of the H-link bracelet would articulate more. These are quite stiff, they don't articulate very much, and so one gets a gap underneath the bracelet and the clasp, the bracelet and the head of the piece. So they could have improved the articulation of the H-link bracelet. Really, it's best suited for a 7 to 8 inch wrist, but if you have a larger wrist, you will enjoy the 41.5mm wrist presence. Right, so I'll do a Lume test and we'll see how the Lume performs when it's charged up to the absolute maximum. So as always, I'm going to use my 100 UV LED torch to charge it up to the absolute peak. Right, so that's now fully charged, and as you can see, they've clearly used C3 Luminova rather than C3 Super Luminova. Initially it appears to be glowing brightly and it looks like 5 to 6 layers versus 2 to 3 layers, but it will quickly begin to fade and fade to nothing because Luminova doesn't have the performance of C3 Super Luminova, but bear in mind this is an €83 low tier price point piece, so one has to expect some cost cutting measures such as the use of C3 Luminova versus BGW9 or C3 Super Luminova. I've described the Lume performance as acceptable. It's okay for an €83 watch, but of course there is room for improvement. They could upgrade it to BGW9 or C3, and I think it's something that collectors would happily pay an additional €5 to €10 on the retail price at €83 in order to get better quality Lume. On a positive note, there's a good colour match between the baton hands and the applied indices. The colour of the green C3 matches, which is good, and this is clearly 5 to 6 layers, so I'm pleased they haven't used the cost-cutting measure of 2 to 3 layers. Had they used 2 to 3 layers on the applied indices and the baton hands, it would be fading quicker. So the Lume is good for the price point, although there is room for improvement. Right, so let's discuss the movement used. You'll all be familiar with the Miyota Caliber 8215. It's a reliable, well-proven workhorse automatic movement. It was made in 1977 and it's been in use ever since, so 45 years. It's at this stage a very reliable, well-proven movement. Now, early versions of the 8215, as I've detailed, did not have hacking, which was the main negative. This is the latest version, which does have hacking, so that's a positive. It has 21 joules and it runs at 21,600 vibrations per hour and a frequency of 3 Hz. 40-hour power reserve is perfectly acceptable. The stated accuracy is -20 to +40 seconds per day, so a rather wide accuracy range. This one is running at +10 seconds per day, which isn't very impressive, but however it is within the -20 to +40 seconds per day stated accuracy. Hand winding and hacking are useful complications. Now, the negatives to the 8215 are it does have a noisy rotor. So one can hear the rotor spinning round when on the wrist, and it's certainly more noisy than an NH35A or an NH38. I personally prefer the latter because it has a quieter rotor. The other negative is it has a unidirectional winding rotor. The rotor has to spin anti-clockwise in order to wind the movements. When the rotor spins clockwise, it has a negligible winding effect. So therefore, it's not as efficient as a bidirectional winding movement. I personally prefer the NH38 because it's quieter, although it does run at the same beat rate and frequency, 21,600 vibrations per hour and 3 Hz. So basic movements, undecorated, very sterile and boring to look at. But however, it does do the job. And bearing in mind this is €83, I think it is acceptable to use the 8215, and I am pleased it's the later version with hacking, although it does have a noisy rotor. That's something to bear in mind. Right, so lastly I'll summarise the piece. What do I think of it overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch meet 2 criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at €83. I think this is good quality and good value at €83. Now, there are some cost-cutting measures such as the lack of AR coating and the lack of superluminova, but at €83 one has to be realistic and expect these kind of cost-cutting measures. Also, there needs to be improvement with the quality control and the finishing of the screw-down crown because it feels rough and stiff, it's not silky smooth, so they do need to refine that. But overall, I'm very impressed with the quality to the finishing to the head of the piece, the bezel, the case back, and also the bracelet. It's actually very well finished throughout, bearing in mind it's only €83, and credit where credit's due, the deployance does work very well, and it's also finished to a good standard. So the quality of the finishing to the head of the piece and the bracelet is good, but however, we do have some cost-cutting measures, and I think you need to be mindful of the fact the 8215 does have a noisy rotor. It's not as quiet as the NH35A and the NH38. But if you're looking for a Patek Philippe Nautilus at €83, this will suffice. So I'm going to recommend it to you for consideration. I'm going to declare it good quality and good value at €83. I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Aimimo design AD-8168. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you very much.